Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special council meeting. We have two items to deal with. One is our strategic session, and the second one is our in-camera meeting authorization. Let's just get that done with so we don't need to worry about it. Moved by Councillor Ioannidis, seconded by Councillor Fernandez. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And we'll now move into item number one, our strategic session, which is on the issue of residential intensification in established neighborhood study. And I will turn it over to Alain to kick things off. Let me turn Leslie on.
Okay, I think we're all set. Good afternoon, Mayor Verbanovic and members of council. This session deals with a hot topic, and it is a topic that has had a high profile for a few years now. Before launching into the discussion, which I am going to be supported by many team members, I'm going to give a brief explanation as to how we got here and what we hope to achieve with today's session. In August of 2013, after a few high-profile concerns regarding residential intensification, staff presented a report that outlined many short-term and long-term actions to address intensification. The short-term actions that were outlined in that report are now in place. On March 30th, we prepared another report that outlined the context for moving forward on the next key piece, the key piece that would launch us into the longer-term actions. And that key piece is the residential intensification in established neighborhoods study. The purpose of today's session is to get feedback and clarification on the scope of the study. Intensification, as mentioned in today's report and in previous reports, can be a very broad topic, and we want to make sure that the final product is consistent with Council's expectations before we get started. The scope of work that we hope to be able to define after today's conversation will have a direct impact on resourcing and the project timing. Because the topic is so broad and has the potential to be very, very, very big, it's important to really have a good handle on the scope. If we were to study every form of intensification, every aspect about intensification, everywhere throughout the city, this study could take up to 3 years to complete. With sufficient scoping, which we hope to achieve by the end of today's session, it is something that we could take approximately 1 year to complete. The way that we've structured today's session is to ask 4 questions. These 4 questions deal with the items that we feel will have a greatest impact on the scope of work as we go to program this work. For 2 of the questions, we are seeking your concurrence with a preferred option that has been identified by staff, and you will see that in today's reports. And for the other 2, we're leaving the discussion completely open. The 4 questions and related information to explain those 4 questions can be found in today's report. And at this point, I do want to flag that for question number 2, and this is one of those questions where we've actually identified a preferred option, we are going to be recommending that option and we'll that recommendation. So we'll get to that when it comes time to tackle that question. The reason why you see so many members of our team here is because intensification is one of those matters that affects all work areas in the planning division. Our policy team, our site development team, and our development approval team. So that is why we're all chipping in to not only prepare this report, but to hear directly from council so that we have a good understanding of what your expectations are for this study. A different staff member will ask each question, And I am, before I hand it over to Janine Osterveld, who will ask question 1, I just want to say that we're really looking forward to having a good conversation here, and we're happy to provide clarification on anything that is before you today. Over to you, Janine.
Okay, just before we do that, we had Councillor Singh who had a question, or not anymore? Oh, okay. Okay, that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thanks, Janine.
Thank you. So the first question that we have is related to the scale of development that occurs on a particular property. And the reason why we're asking this question is that the larger projects, so anything that requires site plan control, for example, triplexes and up, or anything that requires a Planning Act application, like that needs to go to the Committee of Adjustment or for an official plan amendment or zone change, we'll already use an extra tool from our existing toolbox, and that's the Urban Design Manual, to help evaluate whether or not a project is in context with the existing residential neighborhood. So through this particular study, we're automatically going to be evaluating that Urban Design Manual and making sure that it meets the needs of council and is guiding development within that neighborhood for those projects that have a Planning Act application that needs approval. On the smaller end of the scale, the semis, the singles, the duplexes, typically they do not require as a Planning Act application. They might come into play if you had, for example, a minor variance. But for the most part, they just go straight to building permit. So for something to go straight to building permit, the chief building official cannot withhold that building permit for anything other than applicable law. And so in the case of character or fit in a neighborhood, the only applicable law that we have in our existing toolbox is the zoning bylaw, as well as a heritage permit if it happens to be in that particular context. So right now, in terms of what we use for character in a traditional neighborhood as it relates to singles, semis, and duplexes, are things like setbacks, minimum setbacks to front yard, building height, where your parking spot is located, that type of thing. What we're asking in this situation is, there are situations right now with the zoning that we have in place, and we've seen it over the past couple of years where neighbors have had concerns with new developments of this type, maybe a single replacing a smaller single on the site, where they're developed in accordance with the zoning bylaw, but maybe that zoning bylaw doesn't fit that particular street in the neighborhood. So for example, the front yard setback is 4.5 meters required, but every other house on the street that was built many, many years ago is set back a lot farther, and all of a sudden this new house sticks out in front. So the reason why we're asking this question about whether or not we look at this smaller scale is whether or not you want to open up the review to include maybe tools that we're not already using in the toolbox. So exploring, say for example, what Ottawa is doing in terms of their streetscape analysis, or exploring what Oakville's doing in terms of broadening out the scope of site plan control to include the singles, the semis, and the duplexes in specific neighborhoods. That's what we want to understand, whether or not council wants to include that in this study, because it is quite a broader type of study. If that's what you choose to evaluate, that's fine, and we can incorporate that in. We just have to understand within the scope of the big study if that's something that is of interest to council. So that's the question. Should the study investigate approaches for addressing character of smaller projects that do not currently require those Planning Act approvals? So this is the singles, the semis, and the duplexes. And then if you choose to evaluate, we'll also include in that evaluation what are those implications, so that at the end of the study you can make a determination whether or not you would want to include one of those new processes, because that new process is going to change the way home builders, homeowners including if a homeowner wants to do an addition on their house, how they relate to the city, maybe how long it takes to get their approval, and maybe the resourcing on the city's end as well. So we would want to understand the big picture implications to both industry and to the city if we're reviewing some new tools along the way.
Okay, we have a few comments initially. Councillor Singh?
Yeah, thank you. I know we're supposed to answer your question, but I have a question before I answer the question. Early on, I think through Alain, he had said that we already have a guiding principle, which is the urban design guideline. So are we pretty much speaking with what you're saying right now, adding extra layer of bureaucracy and red tape in already as of right homeowners' ability to make improvements or whatever the zoning allows to allow to build in that area? Is that pretty much what you're saying?
Yes, so we'd be looking at the other examples of other municipalities. It was to either refinement to the zoning where it included analysis that was a lot more detailed than just picking a setback, for example, and having that setback be very straightforward across every street in that particular zone, or it's a different approval mechanism like the site plan control.
Right, and I think the current process is serving us well. That's not where the issues are coming. It's pretty much where there's zone changes, so a different usage than what the area allows. So my answer to you is I've never favored extra layer of bureaucracy and extra red tape, so I would not be interested in that.
Councillor Fernandez?
Thank you. Actually, I would disagree with Councillor Singh because I think that some of the issues, that especially in my ward, have come about from existing zoning. So let's talk about 689 Dune Village. The zoning was for an R6. The change happened long before the residents, many of the residents lived in the area. So we went from a small, tiny wartime house to a 4-story massive building. And additionally, at 809 Dune Village Road, it was the same kind of thing. It was a very small house situated well back off the street. Now we're looking at, 72 units that are independently rented. So it really changes the fabric of the neighborhood. So I think that we have to be looking at certainly anything that goes from singles to multiple residential, and so that would be semis and fourplexes, because duplexing could often change from 2 to 4 by is it a variance or no? It's not a variance. When we make we divide it from 1 unit into 2, right? Severance. Yeah. Thank you. It's a severance. So when we sever the semi, then we can make the semi into a duplex as well. Is that correct?
No. Maybe I'll respond to that one through you, Mayor Urbanovic. That used to be the case, but one of the short-term actions, if you recall, from August of 2013 was to actually make some adjustments to our zoning bylaw. So the duplexing of semis is no longer permitted in some of the zones where it previously was. That was by clarifying the definition. So that there were a handful of sort of quick fix zoning changes that were made, and that was one of them. Now, it still could take place in zones that permit higher densities, but it used to, the situations where it was occurring was like in our R5 zone, for example, where we were getting a lot of purpose-built fourplexes that were coming in as semis that got duplexed right from the get-go for the entire duration of the life cycle of that building.
Yeah, I mean, and we all know that the struggle that I'm having in my ward with all of the houses in the Conestoga College Lower Dune area that are being duplexed, and become multiple residential. How are we going to attack that kind of scenario if we don't include that approach in this? Sort of, it's a question as well as a comment, right?
Yes, I suppose, but I mean, the question that we're asking is, do we want to introduce new tools, the tools that we currently don't have, that would be part of our approval processes for change in houses of the scale that are in the question. Because that's
Right.
So we're not making giving a recommendation on whether those new tools are good or bad. That's what the study would determine. But to do that additional work, to develop brand new tools that we currently don't have, is a lot of work. So if council doesn't want to go there, then that simplifies our scope and gives us a better chance of meeting the 1-year target. If this is a priority for a council to explore that, we will, but it will add to our scope of work considerably.
So what is more work, to find out and create the new tools, or to consistently have the council chambers full of residents who are upset and frustrated about significant changes in their neighborhoods, where it takes staff time and council's time to listen to the delegations, to go through the process, to have the discussion, to ask the questions. I mean, if you tally up that time, that's time spent as well, and that's staff time spent as well. So it's obvious that the urban design is not addressing some of the issues that we've been seeing in the past. So, I mean, you'll get my vote yes, that we should be adding the new tools, because I still think that staff time, council's time is being taken up by all of those people who are very unhappy with what's happening in their neighborhoods.
Councillor Netsky.
Thank you. I'm glad to see that this is here before us, because this has been an issue that's been ongoing, as pointed out by Councillor Fernandez in her ward, as well as other wards. You may recall delegations here on Birch Avenue, Edmund Street, and a few others, because residents all of a sudden had lived in those homes, and these are homes that were built back in the 40s and 50s, when the subdivisions, when the cities were starting to grow. Not through a proper subdivision process, but they were happening at that time. Zoning was under the old former Township 878 bylaw, 4830 as well, if we're going back some 50 years or more. And a lot of homes were built on large lots. They were on septic services were eventually coming in. So as a result, planning department went ahead over the years and implemented zoning, residential zoning in those areas, and put in R4 zoning, R5 zoning, and the whole street's developed with single-family houses, and it's been like that since day one. And there may be a house or two that may have sustained a fire damage, or they it was old and it needed to be replaced, and all of a sudden they built something in conforming with the zoning bylaw. Put in a nice big semi, but everything else is singles. And that's what causes the problem, because the residents didn't have any input. And the residents basically saw that the zoning is all into place and there's nothing more they can do. It's exactly what you pointed out. That's what happened. But staff is looking in the older parts of the city, like I said, Birch Avenue up in the North Ward and Edmund by the Eastwood Collegiate area, as potential intensification, potential redevelopment, totally logical and totally acceptable. But that's not what the residents wanted. And they were very, very upset. And that's what brought this whole thing about. So, from my perspective, because you got the zoning there, you could change the zoning back to what would be reasonable, that would fit the character of the area, is one way of doing it. And as you go through the zoning bylaw review, or you provide another layer of review through this particular process. What I would like to know, and maybe you can expand on this, what's the Ottawa streetscape? What's the town of Oakville doing? Maybe if you can elaborate that, or do you have some information that could be handed out or emailed to us sometime to give us a better understanding as to the level of detail that they're going through? And that would help us out, because you just made this as a reference, but right. I have no idea what they're doing there.
Okay. I don't want to take up too much time in all the details, but just to give you a little bit of a snapshot. So Ottawa, for example, in their mature neighborhoods, what they're doing, they're using zoning as the tool, but instead of just allocating a specific setback, for example, what they did is they analyzed about just over 20 characteristics of a neighborhood, and they boiled that down to 4 priorities based on their review of a whole number. I think maybe it was about 500 properties they reviewed, and they came to 4 characteristics that were the most important in determining the character of that neighborhood. Things like where you park your car, how wide your driveway is, how much landscaping is out front, and where your front door is located. I think those are the 4. And then from there, they established a requirement for a streetscape analysis. So each property, when they're going in for a review, they have to analyze the property across the street and 5 on each side, both sides of the street. So they have to do a 21 property review in order to get an approval of whatever they might be doing, whether it's a curb cut or a new building, to make sure that all of those 4 criteria are met through that analysis of that particular street. So it's some broad language to scope it, but tailored to a street based on that streetscape analysis. So each time a project comes in, they have to go through that analysis. With Oakville's tool is they have an urban design guideline specific to residential infill. They also have site plan control that goes down to singles in very specific neighborhoods south of Dundas Street. So in that sense, they're using the urban design tool, the guideline tool, but they're doing a review through site plan control.
Okay, I appreciate that answer, and if that's sort of follow through, that could be good. But on the other hand, the problem that comes down to is once you've established these sort of regulations, restrictions under the zoning bylaw, or however you do it through your urban design guideline, and what's happened, I mean, we go through the process of the official plan, you do the whole official plan review, and you get a number of residents come out, but of the 220,000 people in the city, you only get not even 1,000. When you do the whole zoning bylaw review, the same process. You try to notify everybody, newspaper ads, all the means that you can, and again, you only get a handful of people. It's only when something's happening in my backyard, down the street or across the street, that the issues and the delegations come, and that's the concern, because people do not read official plans and do not read zoning bylaws. They could care less. It's just mundane reading. But the thing is how do you get them to get engaged and know what's happening? And that's the challenge, and that's the difficulty. And I don't know how we can do this. I mean, we're discussing it, which is great. The media is up there, they'll sort of report it, but how many people are still knowing what's going to happen? Very few. I've been on your side of the fence. I know exactly how it works. And that's the challenge. So I think the zoning has to be looked at in terms of the context of what's on that street and what the character of that street is, and have that maintained if that's the objective. But that also has to be weighed against intensification, your parts program of satellite LRT stations, etc. So you've got to look at it in that perspective. And in my opinion, I think you need the tools and you need to do some details on it. So I feel that's the only way that the residents will respond.
Thank you, Councillor Yanetsky. Councillor Marsh.
Thank you. I have a question. So regarding the examples, is it Ottawa and Oakville? If we went ahead and directed staff to approach this, with single-family dwellings and up, would you take a similar approach, or would there be an option, perhaps, to say in the planning, in the study process, identify setbacks that would not vary, a certain distance from the existing ones, on a certain street, so that each time, later on, once it's approved, if you understand what I'm suggesting, that each time, a person comes forward with their address, then it's just clear, on Edmund Street, here's the setback currently, and here's what you would be allowed to vary from that, and that's it, and rather than have to go and do a big study.
That could be something that we explore through this sort of tool, and how we can use some kind of new tool to create a new framework, basically.
So that's within...
That's a possibility.
The possibility.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Speaking as a Ward 10 councillor, I feel compelled to strongly suggest that we do include smaller projects, because indeed, from my understanding, it will not be addressed through zoning, because zoning for R2, for example, would allow for a single-family dwelling, and that's fine, but if the single-family dwelling is extremely differing from the character of the neighborhood, then that wouldn't be addressed. So the two examples that Councillor Yanetsky offered as bringing us to the table today are both in Ward 10, Birch Ave and Edmund Street, and residents in those two neighborhoods and others are extremely upset about the types of projects that, you know, are approved under the current laws. So I really feel that it's not overdoing it in terms of adding red tape. I think it is a responsible thing to do for intensification of our existing and mature neighborhoods.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you. I do have some concerns because I get the sense, and I could be off on this, but that we go through these reviews, you know, every 5 or 8 or 10 years, and while we're looking at the solution being possibly introducing a number of new zones, 8 or 10 years down the road, planners might look back and say, "Whoa, we have way too many zones here. We need to consolidate and go back." And I just want to make sure we're not setting ourselves up for a cycle. Some of the items that Councillor Marsh mentioned, I think, would be appropriate. I mean, if the intention is to have simplified zonings that somewhat take, and I say somewhat because I think there has to be flexibility in the neighborhoods, but somewhat take the things like setbacks, for example, into account. Because obviously in the middle of a street, if every other home is set back 10 meters and then the current bylaw says one can be set back 3 meters and it sticks out, that clearly doesn't fit. But there still needs to be flexibility in that, and it doesn't necessarily need to be set back to the rest of the homes in that street. Because my other part of this, my concern here is when we start looking at the really small, like these small developments, I'm afraid that if things like this might add an extra layer of work and or difficulty for people that want to update and renovate and make a current looking property that's really run down, they may say it's not worth it and they'll move along. We want to make sure we don't add too much extra cost or bureaucracy to make sure that we don't end up having some of these rundown homes stay as they are because it's too difficult to work through.
Councillor Etherington.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, my simple answer to this question would be yes. I feel strongly that you guys are the experts on planning, but the people who live in the older neighborhoods are the experts on neighborhoods, on their own neighborhoods. And I think every opportunity you should listen to them. And I get really tired of hearing the kind of phrases like we're hearing here about one more layer of bureaucracy or the constant refrain of not in my backyard. And even in your report, on page 2 of the report, you take a milder approach, but it's still the same, in my mind, the same approach. It says there are others who have contrary views and may take a stronger, more active role to protect their neighborhood from change. Often, to me, it's not people in neighborhoods trying to protect their neighborhoods from change. They're trying to, that's a negative. They are trying in a positive way to support what they believe should be intensification and have development take place in their neighborhood that fits into the character of that neighborhood. And that's exactly what you say elsewhere in the report. Of course, we should be looking at any development, small or large, that has a substantial impact on a street or neighborhood. So that's where I'm coming from.
Councillor Ioannidis.
Yes, through you, Mayor Urbanovic. I kind of go along the lines of what Councillor Singh, it was his approach. And my concern about this is we hear how many of these development applications and these approvals that are in place that we hear nothing about. We only hear about the one squeaky one that fills up the chamber, and all of a sudden we have a problem. And I really don't think we have a problem. I think if we impose some of these conditions, I think we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of infringing on people's properties, on their rights of their property. And to me, that's fundamentally wrong for me. I can't, we don't need to be Big Brother on every little concern and every issue, especially when it comes to someone that wants to do an addition. And I think we have those tools, and we have the urban design tools, which I think are great tools, and I think we should stick to those tools. And adding any further restrictions, in my opinion, will not only promote higher intensification, because it won't make it worthwhile to have small developments, because why go through all this when I might as well just go and build a high rise and get my money's worth and go through all those headaches for basically for a semi. Like this is a semi we're talking about here. We're not talking about anything. This is like the least intrusive intensification that you could possibly have, and we're actually talking about putting restrictions on it. Like that, to me, that's kind of I think it's ridiculous. There is some circumstances, yes, but I think those are going to be there regardless of whether there's more restrictions or not. They're going to have those contentions, so they're not going to change anything. It's just going to create more red tape, and I know you don't like that word, but it is going to happen. And so I think we need to look at the focus of how many applications have been in there that has had zero complaints and zero issues, and I think that's where we need to look at, and that's probably where it probably lies, in my opinion.
Councillor Schneider.
Yes, through you, Chair Vervanovic. The need to balance, the need to intensify while respecting the character in the neighborhood, I think that's what we're trying to get at here. I love what you said about Ottawa's 4 criteria. It seems like a simplified approach. You use the zoning bylaws, but you also adapt the criteria, those 4 criteria, to the bylaws. So if there is a setback difference, you can adjust the development plans there. Is it, as you say here, investigate approaches for addressing character in a neighborhood? Would it be simple if what works in Ottawa could be quickly adapted here?
I think that it's going to be important to always reflect on what's important to us here in Kitchener. Some of them might boil down to be the same things, but there might be some of, maybe even of the 22 that they started off with when we evaluate our neighborhoods here in Kitchener, maybe it's a different 4 or 5 that we would come down to if you wanted to go that route. The other thing, just to discuss sort of like the simplified, maybe what we're also talking about in terms of if you're looking at this approach and looking at these smaller projects, is having a range of evaluation from area-specific zoning to a more of an evaluative tool through zoning to maybe beyond, and what are the pros and cons of that wide range of ideas.
Okay. I mean, I've seen some great examples of some intensification. I know on Frederick Street near River Road, there was a kind of a ranch-style bungalow that was, I believe, a doctor's office at one point, and that's been replaced by 2 semis that respect the heights and sizes in that neighborhood. So where there was 1 family unit, now there's 4. That's intensification. There were some nice towns built on Frederick near River as well, a new development. So there's ways of doing it respectfully that fill into the neighborhood, and I think that's what we're all trying to get to here, is allow for intensification. And it doesn't need to be a huge high-rise. Intensification could be stacked towns or a semi or something that just, it can still fit into the neighborhood. And I think you've already done some good things with that. So I'd be willing to, keep this dialogue going open to find the right balance to achieve that.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
Yeah, I like the word that Councillor Snyder used, and that's balance, and that's really where I want to come from, because I don't want to make it impossible for intensification to happen, but I do think that there needs to be things that need to be looked at. And I think when it comes to the smaller projects, I think we need to look at and focus more on what the toolkit could be for rebuilds versus some of the smaller things that may happen. So I think that would be the focus, and that if I don't want someone who wants to just put an addition on their home to have to go through the whole review. So maybe it's something like looking at a percentage. If it's more than 25 or 50% of the current size of your home, then it needs to kind of go through more of a review. Or if it's if it's doubling in size so that it no longer fits the character. I also think that setbacks is something that we've talked about, and that should be looked at. But in doing so and in supporting going ahead with this review, I think it's good so that we can have a holistic approach and really look at it. But we have to understand that we'll have the input or some input in the tools that we end up putting in the toolbox at the end of the day. And I think this is step one. You start the review, you bring back those lists like you had talked about, the 22 or whatever Ottawa started with, and we can pick this one's going to work for us, this one's not going to work for us. And I think that'll help solve some of the problems moving forward.
Okay, I see some folks want to go in a second time. You can keep your comments because we're already over time, short, because we need to get on to the other items. And I also have some comments on this. Councillor Singh.
Yes, thank you. I'll be very short. Councillor Ioannidis raised a really good point as reflection on the number of infill growth that does take place every year. So quickly, a question of staff. Do you know by hand, in comparison to greenfill, what percentage is infill development?
Through you, Mayor Verbanovic, I don't know if we have things that measure exactly what you're asking, but this may give us a bit of an idea.
A broad understanding.
That 60% of our housing starts last year were in the built-up area. Now, that includes, of course, a few very large apartment projects, some that can be viewed from my office window, but also a large range of smaller ones. The ones that we don't have any information on today would include some that we're putting on the table today, and that is the infill projects, the intensification projects that they already have as of right zoning, and they go straight for building permit.
Great. No, I think
that's something that we could conceivably pull together, but we don't have that information. And every now and then there's a flurry of pushback like we had in Ward 10 maybe a couple of years ago.
No, I think that's helpful. You gave a broad understanding as to the extent of development that does take place on the infill. I think that information in future dialogues would be helpful to have for staff to be able to ask this question, for us to be able to ask this question again. And quickly, my comment, and I said I would be quick, is that I want to make sure that apart from not wanting additional hurdles for development to occur in our built-up areas, I think Councillor Schneider has said it best. It needs to be a balanced approach. And I think that balanced approach, rather than adding additional restrictions, can be through stricter urban design guidelines that can establish those expectations as to what type of development should take place in our inbuilt area. Thank you. Councillor Fernandez.
I guess I'm hearing a couple of comments from some of the councillors who may have a bit more of a vested interest than others in terms of how the additional tools and additional regulations may affect those decisions. I guess my comment would be, if we really want to hear what the residents are saying, we have to make...
Councillor Ioannidis. Hold on. Hang on. I've got too many people in the queue. Councillor Ioannidis. Point of order.
That's out of line.
What is out of line?
What's out of line?
Certain comments that are made by me because I have interest. What interest do I have?
I didn't name anybody. I said comments by councillors. I mean,
there's two comments here that were made that were contrary to what your opinion is.
Okay, folks, let's...
Anyways.
Okay, folks, hold on. I've got the chair right now, and I just want to be clear. part of having this discussion is there's going to be differences of opinion on this issue. I do think, in fairness, I think differences of opinion are healthy. They need to be respected. Just like there's differences of opinion around this horseshoe, there's differences of opinion in the community around what's right and what is less preferred in terms of infill development. I think I would suggest, Councillor Fernandez, however, that the issues that we're talking about are interests in common, that every member around this council table has. Presumably, if you own property in the city of Kitchener, what we're talking about is an interest in common that everybody has, and to suggest something different may not be appropriate.
Okay. Yep.
Go ahead.
Thank you. One of the things that we continue to hear from residents, and I hope I'm not repeating myself, is the fear that at any time the house next door to them could be changed from a single-family home into a semi, because my understanding is R2 zoning allows for a semi-detached. Is that correct?
Who wants to respond to that?
Through Mayor Verbanovic, I don't believe a semi is permitted in R2, but it is permitted in our R3 and 4. We can get back to you on the R2.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
I'm not so sure about the R2, but it is permitted in other low-rise residential areas as of right, yes.
So, but
duplexing is permitted as of right.
Duplex is permitted as of right, except for a handful of areas where it's specifically not permitted.
Right.
Okay, so duplexing is allowed in any single-family home for the majority of the city right now as our standards go.
Single detached homes, yes, except for the areas that have been specifically excluded.
Like the Lower Dune area.
The Lower Dune area
Okay.
is one of them, yes.
But I often get phone calls, and maybe because of my proximity, my ward's proximity to the Conestoga College area, residents calling me and saying, my neighbor is duplexing their house, is that allowed? And so those are the concerns that I hear, because it does change the parking, it changes the usage around the house. Sometimes it doesn't change it dramatically, but other times it does change it dramatically. And I think that that's where we need to listen to the complaints that maybe it hasn't necessarily come through staff, but it's come to us as a ward councillor. And those are the kind of things that I think that we don't want to fill up the gallery again and again and again, as I said in my previous comments. It does take staff's time. I'd rather be proactive than reactive.
Okay. Nobody else in the queue. I'll just make a couple quick comments. Certainly, as I was going door to door, this is one of the issues that came up probably the most alongside traffic in terms of how our city's growing and developing, and what does growth and development, particularly in existing neighborhoods, mean for the future of our community, and how that'll impact existing neighborhoods. I too like the word that's been used by some members of council earlier today, and that's the word balance. I think what we're talking about here is looking at solutions and looking at best practices in municipalities across the country. We've heard of Ottawa and Oakville reference today. I would encourage us to go outside of this province as well. Edmonton's done some leading edge work on this front, and I would hope that we would look at that as well as part of the work that we do going forward. I recognize that there are some structures in Ontario, like the OMB, that don't exist in a province like Alberta, but that doesn't preclude us from looking at them for best practices and bringing some of that into play in terms of how we look at this. When you look at their particular document, it talks about, for example, when it comes to, it breaks new development into 4 areas. Small scale, which talks about things like secondary suites, garage suites, small lots, semis, duplexes, fourplexes. Medium scale, which talks about stacked rows, 3 or 4 stories, low rise apartments, 3 or 4 stories. Large scale infill, which is 5 to 8 stories or 9+ stories, and large sites that end up having significant redevelopment. And then there's a whole series of criteria that look at principles such as a fair share of housing mix, proximity to things like their LRT, ensuring that new development doesn't isolate, making sure that mass and scale are respected. So the kind of principle that Councillor Galloway-Seelock raised, where maybe you create a percentage, whereas if you've got a 2,400 square foot home and you're going to add up to another 1,200 or 2,000 square feet, whatever that magic number is, it doesn't go through that same level of scrutiny as it would if all of a sudden you want to double it or more than double it. And that's the kind of thing that I think we should be looking at outside of the context of an individual application. So we put as many of those guidelines and principles into place that both the neighborhood and the development industry understand ahead of time. It's going to take some of the emotion and some of the difficulty, and we've seen it in the council chambers time and time again. I think, over the past term of council, most wards have dealt with it at some point in time, and members of council have had those issues coming to the council chamber, and they've been frustrated with them. How do you come to terms with the fact that, yes, it's good planning, for example, to put a 6-story building in an existing neighborhood, but then the neighborhood doesn't want it, and how do you find those compromises? So I think, coming to an understanding around what those neighborhood and development industry objectives are, figuring out what the tools are for different sizes of projects. I too wouldn't want to make it unreasonably difficult, prohibitive, or bureaucratic for Joe, average citizen, to be able to do an addition in their house. But if somebody's going to come in and all of a sudden want to do something that's significantly different, that doesn't sit with the rest of the neighborhood, and we need to figure out what that threshold is, then there should be a higher level of scrutiny on those kinds of projects, and we need to make sure that they're built in a way that respects those existing neighborhoods. So that's where I come from on this issue. So I don't think it's a yes, include singles and small residential, or don't include it. I think it's looking at it and looking at what criteria might kick some sort of review in going forward. So with that, we'll go on to question number 2, and I'll turn it over to Tina.
So,
sorry. Yep. Go ahead.
Sorry, Mayor Verbanovich. Because it wasn't clear that there was a consensus here, and there seems to be like a range of opinion, it would be good to get some kind of sense as to what the sort of majority direction is from council on this. And from having listened to the different members of council express themselves, I can see the one question almost like becoming 2 components, and maybe because a lot of people talk about better zoning that's more respectful of what's on the ground, and that's one area of work which is slightly different than some of the other new areas of work. So that is something that we can study and then inform Crosby. And then the other items that were on the table were actually developing new tools. We're not recommending whether we do these tools or not, but to actually study them. And that is, if we look at it, we're doing it. It's just, I don't know, we heard clearly, yes, do it, or no, not look at it. We're not making a recommendation on that, but it would be good to at least get a sense as to whether this is a majority position, half and half, so that when we develop a terms of reference for this, it's one that will meet with the approval of council.
Well, I guess I'll make 2 comments, and I see your comments have created a whole other list of people lighting up. I guess I would say to you is the intent behind these kind of strat sessions is to have a more of a free-flowing dialogue and not necessarily give specific, clear direction. It's an opportunity for staff to hear the kind of input that council has and to factor that into the work that you're doing going forward. So I don't know if that's the answer you wanted to hear, but
we can work with that, certainly, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Councillor Davey?
In light of that, I was just needed one clarification if we're going to vote. But if we're not going to vote, I just want to be clear on this as well. While I think some baby step tweaks in this direction are appropriate. I want to be clear that if any of this comes back with the requirement of additional staff FTEs to carry out this, not carry out the work, but I mean to do the ongoing work in the future, I will not be supporting that. I just want to be clear on that point.
Councillor Fernandez?
I guess my previous statement stands. I want us to be more proactive, because it does come out, sometimes it comes out of the blue where staff have to take additional time and resources to respond to reaction from the public when a substantial change in their neighborhood happens, rather than instead of being reactive. So if we're proactive now, and it takes a little bit more time and it takes a little bit more staff resource time now, then we don't have to be reactive, and then we're piling work on top of work and taking time on top of time when we should have been proactive in the beginning. Did that make sense? I'm sorry, I did flip them back and forth. I apologize.
Councillor Yanetsky?
Thank you. And looking at the balance of the report, I mean, staff has got 2 recommendations dealing with the other questions and nothing on this particular one. So I was going to move to provide some direction to staff in terms of examining and exploring further the 2 municipalities that they've made reference to. And as part of the zoning bylaw review, to not create any more zoning categories, but to take the zoning categories that we have now and add special regulations to particular areas that need to be done. And that's all part of the zoning bylaw review that you're doing right now. So it goes hand in hand in terms of what they're working on right now, and it could just be continued on and looked at certain parts of the city. And then when they're looking at the setbacks, height, massing, etc., that'll be all part of the zoning regulations. So I think that's the direction that they would go, and I think that's where we should be heading.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock?
Well, I'm just wondering if there's like a next step that we need that, you've heard the feedback, and then maybe it's another report that comes back that kind of gives, so I don't know if that'll help formulate like where we need to go from here.
That may be something, I think, at the end of today that staff may want to take a look at. They don't feel they have the clarity that they need to set specific work direction. I think they can take into account the feedback that we've given, take a look at how other municipalities have maybe approached this early on, and bring a report back to then give a specific direction, which we can then consider to guide their work if they feel they need that.
Right, I think that would be good, especially on this one where there doesn't seem to be consensus. There may be majority, but there may not be consensus, but we may be able to, if there's an interim step, before they go and do a full-blown analysis on all of this stuff, that we can give better direction once we have maybe a few more details on where you're going to go with it.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, so now over to Tina. If you can click in. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Janine. I'm going to present question 2, and unlike question 1, I'm going to provide a recommendation for council to consider. I will explain, and the recommendation is a little different. That's before you in the staff report that you have, and I will explain that again. So the purpose of question 2 is to understand the types of neighborhoods or the geographic locations within the city that the study should review and examine. There are no economies of scale with this work. A citywide scope means more neighborhoods, more issues to examine, more stakeholders to engage, and more potential solutions. Accordingly, to keep the scope of the study to a 1-year time frame, planning staff are endorsing a phased approach and recommend that the area of the study focus on the central neighborhoods and the Vanier planning community. This area is shown in an attached schedule, which I believe is on the overhead that we could turn on. The reason for recommending this is within the last several years, there's been an increased activity in intensifying in established neighborhoods, particularly in close proximity to the Ion Rapid Transit Corridor. The central neighborhoods and the Vanier community comprise a significant portion of the Ion Transit Corridor. They also include lands affected by the city's secondary plans, which were not reviewed as part of the official plan review. It includes 3 of the city's heritage conservation districts and a lot of neighborhoods that were established pre-1994. If a phased approach is taken, this study would provide a recommendation on how to address the remainder of the city. So before you, I have a revised recommendation that the study focus on the central neighborhoods and the Vanier planning community.
Okay, great. We have a few people with comments. Councillor Davey.
Thank you. I don't think this is worthy of much discussion. I think it's appropriate and it takes staff's time into account, so I would move it.
Okay. I would come back to you. This is one area where I think giving some initial direction could help out, and so I think we can do that. Councillor Fernandez?
Well, I mean, everybody knows the situation in my ward, so I will be respectfully say, please do not negate Ward 4 and what's been happening there. We have a very unique situation. I understand that you've got the ION and you've got all that going on in central neighborhoods, and but the changes that are happening both in Upper Dune with regard to the Heritage District and the student housing, and especially with the acknowledgement that the college plans to grow another 25% in the coming years, we have to address that now. We cannot wait for a phased-in approach. So if you can add this into your work, I apologize if it's more work, but if we leave this alone, we are going to continue along a very detrimental impact to my ward and to the residents in that area.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
I just think it's important. Tina's already pointed it out. And it's the last sentence on the page of the question, but I think it's important to be included right in the recommendation that, beyond the communities that we're going to do in the initial phase, that the recommendations from this review will help to address the remainder of the city. I think that needs to be included right in the recommendation, so it's just not lost, that it's right there in black and white, that we're doing these, and then when we do the others, that it'll help form some of that. So I hope that, I know Councillor Davies moved it, I hope that's okay to add to the recommendation, but I'm supportive.
Councillor Yanetsky.
I do agree with these central neighborhoods to be examined because that's where the core of the issues are. However, also adding Vanier Planning Committee was one thought. I was surprised that it was not included, but now I'm glad to see it's included because that's the old 3rd, 4th, 5th Avenues, and they've been around for quite a while. And again, those are much larger lots. It's going through changes, and so I think that there could be some issues there. I totally agree that the Lower Dune area has got to be examined. That's an area that was annexed back in '73 into the city and has been a controversial area from the processing of the block plans that have gone through back in the 70s and 80s process that really didn't address the issues totally, but just try to do more land assembly. But I think the Lower Dune area and the boundaries can be still fine-tuned with staff and the ward councillor on that, doing that. The other two areas that you may want to take into consideration is the old Centerville area. That may be undergoing some changes, and the old Bridgeport East area. You may want to consider that. So I'm not pushing those, but there may be just food for thought. But I basically support the plan, specifically adding Lower Dune for sure.
Councillor Etherington.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, I agree completely with this recommendation. Because this is the area that will be it already is under the most pressure in coming years. In my ward, I've got 6, possibly 7 LRT station areas, and everywhere I turn at the moment, I already see those community pressures. We have to do everything possible to safeguard those established central neighborhoods as LRT moves ahead. So I agree with that.
Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, I'm more agreeable this afternoon than when I was this morning when I looked at it, realizing that there is an area, large area in the ward that I represent that has been affected. In reviewing this, I would have liked to have known what it would take, what alternatives there are. What would it take to do the whole city? I would like to have seen the whole city looked at. I guess what I'm hearing is that some of the things that we learn from this area we can use in other areas of the city that haven't been specifically looked at. But I was just curious as to, what are the time differences to look at the whole city as opposed to what we've got slated here. At any rate, I do support what is slated here. But
okay, just Mr. Pernard, before you answer this, I guess just to be clear, when it's not an either or, it's phase 1, phase 2 is my understanding. So we'd eventually get to it, but I think Councillor Gazzola's question still is valid in the sense that if we waited to do all of it, how long would it take to do all of it versus a phase 1, phase 2 approach?
Okay, to you, Mayor Verbanovic, we haven't actually developed the project plan yet. In order to do that, we are going to consider the feedback that we've received on these 4 questions. But we've done a lot of project planning in our division. And based on a high-level assessment, if we do maximum case scenario on all 4 items before you, we're looking at about 3 years. This is one of those items that is more likely to push us closer to the 3rd year end of the spectrum than the 1-year end of the spectrum.
Sorry, say that last part again. I didn't hear that.
So this is one of those items that if we go the maximum case scenario, so the whole city,
right,
it's more likely once we develop a work plan that it's going to actually push us closer to 3 years, because things like engagement, bus tours, things that are going to come up in future questions, these are things that have to be multiplied by factors of neighborhoods, geography, geographic distance, and so on. So this one is very critical into our impacting our scope of work. So I'm thinking this in combination with another one, if it goes maximum case scenario, we're looking closer to 3 years rather than 1.
Okay. Whereas right now, potentially, you're saying it's closer to the 1-year time frame, and then phase 2 or whatever would follow afterwards.
That is correct. And some of the and it's the contextual stuff that is very specific to geographies, but a lot of our initial research on practices and so on, that is something that we get to reuse for when we move into the other neighborhoods. These neighborhoods share a lot of similar attributes. So in terms of typologies of issues, we're talking about looking at fewer of them because the housing stock is of similar vintage, and they were developed during an era where certain development patterns were fairly homogeneous. In other parts of the city, these are areas that are post our current zoning bylaw. We're talking about a much newer housing stock, which are built to different setbacks. So there are different issues. The student housing issue, I will admit, is an issue. We do see it as being different than the others. It's more than just a planning issue. It's also a bylaw enforcement issue. It's also a fire issue. And that is something that is on our work program to tackle as a corporate project. It's not in our business plan yet because the year that it would come in would actually be added this year. But a 2018 project to actually look at the entire framework as a corporate project, not just a planning project for Dune, is something that's on our table. It's not something that we have the capacity to do now with all the project-based work we have.
Councillor Gazzola?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's what I wanted to hear. I am satisfied, though, and hopefully that what we learn from these areas that we do look at, that we will keep those in mind in looking at other areas of the city that have yet to come under specific examination. So if I get that commitment from staff, I would be pleased to hear that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Singh?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's been clarified well enough that there are no areas of the city that will be ignored. It's only that the focus is in areas that are more in need, that are more significantly impacted as of now with the development happening in our inner core. And I think the effort should be taken to take lessons that we learn from the process with the designated area and then to practice those, and as we broaden out to other parts of the city. So I would support what's outlined.
Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, through you, Chair Vervanovic. My sense is that by doing it this way, by doing one smaller piece to start, that will make the next phases a little more time efficient to complete?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I just want to commend you on the issues, the design issues that you're considering, especially the streetscape, where the character-defining elements, how new development fits into the established character of the street. That's very important, so I'm willing to support this as well.
Councillor Onetsky.
I just want to comment in terms of the area of the suburban neighborhoods that have been that's shown here on the map. That's the areas that are not going to be examined. They've already been done that over the years through the official plan, and a lot of the community plans or secondary plans have been identified that get down to the land uses that are quite specific. And as a result of the growth of those lands, the zoning bylaw was implemented. So those areas have been already covered, and there's no need to repeat it, because if you look at the issues, there's really very little happening out there, and maybe the exception with Lower Dune, because it's very unique. But the other community plans, whether you're talking Stanley Park or Forest Heights or Laurentian or wherever, they're all planned communities, gone through the secondary plan process, fully developed, zoning's in place, and not really an issue that would be created in the future, as I would see it. And staff may want to comment on that as well.
Councillor Marsh.
So I'm just unclear about, in Ward 4, isn't student housing not taking over the whole Ward 4, but wouldn't it be a smaller area that you're most concerned about, Councillor Fernandez?
Councillor Fernandez.
It's not just taking over Lower Dune anymore. It's bleeding out into the Pioneer Park area, into the Green Valley Drive area. Now there are townhomes there, so that's not the change, but it's when houses, single-family houses, are changed over to duplexes, and then quads and garages are converted to bedrooms. That's the changes that I'm seeing everywhere throughout the entire ward.
Okay. I was just hoping that we could find an amenable solution to address the concerns at Conestoga College, but from what I am understanding is if we don't do this phased approach, we're not going to come to any kind of implementable changes for 3 years, and so that doesn't sound like a timeline that I'd be willing to live with. So I wonder if staff could comment on the possibility of adding just Ward 4, or if you could just elaborate on what you feel is different about the Ward 4 challenges compared to the central neighborhoods.
I'll make the initial response, and perhaps Tina will want to add to it. But we think that the issues in around the Conestoga College area are fundamentally different than what we are facing in the area that's being recommended. There's a different driver, and it's different building forms. Anything that does require an OPA zone change still has all our other tools in place in Conestoga. The change that's internal to buildings or that is in the as of right introduces a host of issues that actually have that go way beyond just planning. So it's not only the people that are sitting to my left here who would have to commit to addressing them. It would involve other city business units as well, fire, bylaw, because a lot of those issues tie into behavioral issues. And for that reason, it would automatically to go and seek out and get feedback from those other business units, and the fact that it's introducing different types of issues, that it makes it a whole additional scope of work than what otherwise is what we're presenting. And I don't know if this is going to help council's considerations on that or not, but some of the municipalities that are cited as being leaders in this area, such as Ottawa, they did do a phased approach. So they started what pretty much coincides with their core area, and they are now moving on to other parts of the city. But they did proceed on a phased basis.
Councillor Ioannidis.
Yes, through you, Mayor Urbanovic. I support staff's recommendation. I think this is important that we do at least a baby step first instead of blanketing the whole city without really understanding the consequences. I think we can learn a lot from this process, and I don't think we should bite more than what we can chew at this point. And I think that this is the prudent way, and I think with regards to the Conestoga area, I think it is a different animal. I think it does deserve its attention on its own. So I'm supportive of this recommendation.
Okay. Councillors Davey and Fernandez, you've spoken already, so so I'll just make my comments. I, too, concur that I think this approach of starting off with a smaller portion of the city makes sense because it gets us looking at the broad principles sooner rather than later and gets those established, which will then help us in our work with other parts of the city. So the sooner that we can get that in place, I think it's going to help us significantly. The reality is, and I'm happy to see the Vanier neighborhood's been added, the reality is, while there will certainly be projects in all corners of the city, the LRT is likely going to see an increased level of activity in the neighborhoods that have been identified. So it only makes sense to start our work there and get those principles in place in order to, quite frankly, help manage staff workload in dealing with all those applications. Because if we can get some principles in place that minimize those conflicts that we've seen at times in the past, that's going to help on staff time, it's going to help on council time, and it's going to minimize some of the complications we've had. I think when it comes to student housing, I want to make 2 points. Number one, Doon isn't the only area in the city that has student housing. We have student housing downtown now as a result of the two universities being downtown as well. And while the scope of the issue may not be the same, there are similarities in terms of how those two issues are impacting neighborhoods, and what we learn from that could subsequently be applied in looking at the Doon issue. The final point I want to make about the Doon issue outside of the infill guidelines is the issue of student housing is a broader issue than just infill residential guidelines. And it's one that we're going to have to deal with and we're going to have to prioritize. This notion that it's only going to be on the work plan in 2018, if I heard correctly, certainly is a surprise to me, and that I don't believe is a direction that's been set by council, and that I think is a conversation we're going to have on another day, because I would concur with Councillor Fernandez's point in this regard that it is taking up a lot of resources in our organization. It's impacting the neighborhood, and we're going to have to deal with the issue. But it's broader than just the infill residential guidelines. And so I think we're going to have to deal with that in that context and have the debate and discussion around how to resource it appropriately. So with that, I'll go to you, Councillor Davey.
Thank you. The recommendation is in the appendix at the bottom of question 2. So we'll just be adding the word Vanier, so it would be that the study focus on central neighborhoods and Vanier for the initial phase. I will add, at Councillor Galloway-Seelock's suggestion, the portion of the sentence right above that after the comma, so that would say that that the study would include a recommendation on how to address the remainder of the city.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Fernandez. Actually, we're in special council. Can I have a seconder for that? Councillor Ioannidis, okay. Councillor Fernandez.
Okay. I appreciate your comments about the 2018. I know I've spoken to Mr. Pinard a number of times, and he's sort of thrown around the 2017, 2018 timeframe. With the incredible growth that's happening around the college, we absolutely have to address it before 2018. and that's a conversation for another day. But I guess my question to you, Mayor Rabinovich, is if I don't support this recommendation, I'm not saying that I don't support what staff is doing, but I'm saying that I'm not supporting it because you've excluded the Lower Dune as part of this work program, and I think it's critical that some component of Lower Dune is included in this. So I just want to put that statement out there.
You can. I think to be clear, I don't think anybody's saying that Lower Dune is being excluded. All that the motion says is that there is a number of neighborhoods that are being included in Phase 1, and Lower Dune would be included in a subsequent phase. So I want to make sure that we're accurate on what's happening here. And if you want Lower Dune included, you certainly have the ability to add that as an amendment. And if the amendment carries, then fine. If it doesn't, then we'll deal with it accordingly.
And that was my next comment. Actually, was that I would like to add that as an amendment, that it be included in the geographic location of the neighborhoods that are being studied.
Okay. Is there a seconder for that? Second by Councillor Netsky. Okay. Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
Yeah, I was going to offer Councillor Fernandez maybe a solution other than going that far, because it may not pass. So I thought maybe what you could amend or look at was making sure that an amendment that said that Lower Dune gets priority in Phase 2, or if the overall review is done by planning, bylaw, and the other departments that Mr. Pennard has done first, then it doesn't have to, like, that work will be incorporated into it. So it has priority in Phase 2, and unless the overall big picture review is done before Phase 2 begins. I just thought that might be a nice interim. It gets it in there that you want it as a priority, but it doesn't necessarily push it into Phase 1. So it's just a thought, because I've heard from staff and can't support the amendment as you've stated now, but wouldn't mind supporting something along that line.
Councillor Fernandez, are you responding?
Yes. I guess I mean, I appreciate Councillor Galloway-Seelock's suggestion, but there's the big if is if the work that is being done gets done sooner. I think that's what I'm understanding you to say. Additionally, if the issues are addressed by bylaw and fire first before the infill, before we get to next Phase 2, though it doesn't necessarily have to be moved quicker. It just can fall into into Phase 2 as it would fall into Phase 2. Is that my understanding of your suggestion?
Whatever comes first. So whatever can happen fastest for Lower Dune is what happens. So whether it's the intensification or the bigger picture overall review.
I continue to be really concerned about it being pushed out too far, and so I'm going to leave I appreciate it, but I'm going to leave my amendment to stand as it is.
Okay, Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, can this recommendation refer to this map? Can that be included in the recommendation?
Can the map be included?
Yes, yeah.
I would think so. I'll look to the clerk. Can the map be included as part of the recommendation? Yeah.
So and along with that line, I would like to know then, if we're talking Lower Dune, what are we talking?
What area are we talking?
Yeah, we're dealing with something else later today, which talks about Lower Dune, which
okay.
I want to clarify where Lower Dune is.
Mr. Pennard, can you comment on that?
I think most people in this room have a general idea of what part of the city we're talking about, although in terms of defining the boundaries, it really is something that would need to be defined. It's the area around Conestoga College. It's the area that, before you get into the Pioneer Park area. I'm going to suggest, if it's okay through you, Mayor Verbenich, that perhaps that the ward councillor can actually suggest a geographic description that we're talking about. But I'm generally thinking the area in the vicinity of Conestoga College, it's an area that's identified in our official plan as one that requires further study. The additional study that we are planning to do would be implementing those official plan policies and addressing what we're hearing here today.
Well, is Lower Dune not actually a planning neighborhood?
So we actually have, I believe, two, and I'm going to turn around and look at Della to maybe give me confirmation, but we actually have two community plans, old-style community plans. They used to be called block plans back then. And
but I guess what I'm asking is it one of our 22 planning neighborhoods? Or whatever that, I think the number's 22, isn't it? Or am I confusing that with neighborhood association numbers?
Planning communities off the top?
Yeah, the Vanier Planning Community is one such community, so we could refer to the community plan to get the exact name of and boundaries from that plan.
Okay. Councillor Fernandez, you wanted to comment?
I'd be happy to give some boundaries for Mr. Pinard's consideration and staff's consideration. So the boundaries that I'm talking about would be Homer Watson Boulevard, and of course the Grand River would be the you can't go any further. And then I'm terrible with east and west, but as far as Mill Park Drive, and I mean there is no other. I guess the final road would be Dune Village Road, but that sort of encompasses Old Mill Road as well. So it's a bit of a triangle in terms of, but it goes a little bit further because it crosses the river. It crosses into the Mill Park area, where we're seeing the same changes we've had in Amherst Drive.
So you're essentially talking streets like Chalmers, Ruse, Mill Park, Amherst and other areas like that?
Right.
Okay. Okay, so you've made an amendment and it was seconded by Councillor Yanetsky. Okay, there doesn't appear, Councillor Singh?
Quickly as a comment, I'll support the amendment if, as the ward councillor, she feels that that's necessary work, immediate, and it's time sensitive. But I think we've heard clearly from staff by adding additional, geographical area, it's going to delay the entire work plan for phase one as well for the other central area that are, far more severely impacted as of immediate for infill development. As to what the projection is outside of student-oriented development or student-oriented issues, which goes, I think, out of the scope of what staff had in mind. But if, as a ward councillor, you're comfortable with the delay in the other areas as well, I will reluctantly support it.
Question of staff: what would to add that small area? What kind of additional time frame are we looking at?
So, to you, Mayor Verbanek, we have not programmed this, and it's not adding the entire rest of the city, but it does add a completely different typology with different sets of issues. So, adding this area has a much bigger impact on our workload than adding the Vanier neighborhood, for example, which has many similar attributes and issues to our original recommendation. And it does pull in issues that are not just planning. I'm going to suggest that we're probably, and this is just off the top, I haven't programmed this, put it through our project management software or anything, but I'm saying at least half a year by adding this area.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that information. I'll just briefly give my comment. I understand where Councillor Fernandez is going with the amendment, and I too share concerns in terms of the residential neighborhoods around Dune and the need to address the issue of student housing. As you're aware, Councillor Fernandez, that's something that I've spoken of as well, and am committed to working with you and the college and others to begin to address these issues. I do think, though, that it needs to be looked at comprehensively in the context of all of the issues, which include fire and bylaw and everything, and not just in the context of infill. I also believe that some of the broad principles will be covered off in terms of looking at these neighborhoods that we're looking at, because they do include students as well. So I think it's important that we keep it fairly homogeneous in terms of the neighborhoods that we're looking at, and they're all essentially connected because of the links to light rapid transit as our first priority, and dealing with the issue there. But I also want to reiterate that the broader issue of student housing is a timeline issue that we're going to need to talk about, because it isn't one that can wait until 2018. So while I won't support the amendment, I certainly will be pushing to see us prioritize that work in the work plan. And I think it's, from the kind of comments that Councillor Galloway-Seelock made and so on, whether we look at it through that overall student housing work plan or whether we look at it as the first part of phase 2, I think one of those will see it happen in an appropriate and quick time frame. Sure. So recorded vote on the amendment. This is the Lower Dune amendment. All those in favor? All those opposed? The amendment does not carry. We'll now deal with the original motion, and we'll deal with that with the recorded vote as well. And that carries unanimously. Okay, we'll now go on to question 3. And Dana. Thanks, Tina.
Yes.
Whoops, let me turn you on. There you go.
Like question 2, question 3 also includes a staff recommendation. So question 3 asks, what are some of the design issues that we should be considering when we do this study? A new building in an established residential neighborhood results in a change to an existing streetscape. To achieve positive benefits of residential intensification, new development needs to fit into the character of a neighborhood. This study will examine what type and what amount of change is appropriate and how new developments can be designed in keeping with the character of our established neighborhoods. It is that result that staff have provided a recommendation that the following design issues be addressed as part of the study. The front yard setback, so the actual front yard setback of existing developments in relation to what is being proposed. The height, building mass, and step backs for upper stories, so the built form in relation to the surrounding buildings. The landscape amenity area, so the use of the lands in front, the corner side yards, such as soft landscaping, amenity areas, and walkways. Parking, the incidence and location of parking, the type and access to parking. And the streetscape, so the character-defining elements, so how a new development fits in with the established character of the street.
Okay, we have a few people with comments. Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
I'm just prepared to move the recommendation and agree that all of those are important to include in the work.
Okay. Councillor Marsh.
I'll second it.
It's already been seconded.
Okay, I didn't hear that.
Sorry. Okay.
I thought I heard something I wasn't.
Yeah.
Sure. All right.
Any comments? Whoops. Go ahead.
I'm fully in support of this recommendation. I think it is a smart way forward.
Okay. Councillor Singh.
Yeah, thank you. And I support what's here. I think it is advisable for us to give our opinion as to what holds a higher criteria over others. Trying to say this the best I can. Just because it was, built in a certain way in 1960 doesn't mean that it was built the right way now. So we have to be innovative and forward-thinking as well with design criteria. So when it comes to front yard, side yard, building height, and that's where the innovation kind of comes in, depending on the new type of technologies in build form, as well as the type of structure. Where I think it needs to be consistent to a neighborhood, to be more sensitive, building mass, parking, streetscape, I think that's where the priority needs to lie more. But I'll support what's there.
Councillor Etherington?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. In short, I support this. To me, this question piggybacks on question 1, which I also supported. And these are the tools, or some of the tools, that help to protect the established character of any neighborhood. So I support them in full, as particularly the last bullet recommendation about streetscape. Thank you.
Councillor Onetsky?
Yeah, these 5 bullet points are well to be considered as part of the study. And I think the critical one is the building mass, which is the one that stands out the most in terms of the impact on the residents. And that building mass, and I'm just looking for a clarification from staff, whether it would be considered as part of the calculation of the lot area coverage, because when you get a building that you want to tear down and somebody wants to build something new, they try to maximize the opportunity of the size of the building, still meet the requirements of side yard, rear yards, front yards, and all that stuff, but it really still looks like a monster home and meeting the requirements. So does the lot coverage falls into the building mass in terms of consideration?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, it does, and that'll be looked at through the study.
Good. We'll be monitoring it.
Councillor Fernandez?
We're talking about front and side yards. So where does backyards fall into this? Because that can also have a big change if the house is set back further. If the new house is set back further on the property and it's larger, you may end up with all of a sudden from a nice large lot and a difference between the back house and the new house or the new building. How are you addressing the backyards? Because that's amenity space for a lot of families, right?
Through the chair, amenity space was not really addressed as part of this criteria. We can look at it as part of the study. However, just to caution you, it will have an impact on the scope of the work.
Okay. I just think that when we're talking about if you're talking about building height and massing, that does impact people that live behind something that changes significantly. Mm-hmm. The other one I wanted to ask about was because you're talking about landscaping, you're talking about soft landscaping. Can you give me a definition of what soft landscaping means? Like, are we talking about tree preservation here, or are we not? Is that not included?
Through the chair, it's landscape materials versus hardscape, which would be concrete, cement, walkways, driveways. So yes.
Okay. So how do we put? Sometimes we also see some large significant trees that are on properties are completely removed because it's standing in the way of the new driveway or the parking lot. How do we add in some tree preservation guidelines to this? I know we do have that according to our site review plan policies, but we're looking at reviewing. So.
Mm-hmm. Again, we could look at tree preservation, but again, that would increase the scope of the work and that would also increase the time that the study would take to be completed.
Okay. I'd like to see those added if we can.
Okay, well, I guess I'm trying to understand how trees aren't included in landscaping and streetscape already.
They would be, yes.
Okay, so then that won't add to the scope of the work then. So we're good to go, correct?
Yeah, for the side and the front yard. The amenity area.
Okay. Mr. Wilmer.
I think the distinction here is tree preservation. It's the preservation of existing mature trees is the issue Councillor Fernandez is wanting to get into. landscaping can mean installation of new trees. So I think it's a very different issue.
Okay, I guess, but we have a separate tree preservation policy already, do we not?
Yes, we do.
So I'm just trying to understand what's being asked for here that isn't already in place.
So we're actually recommending that we look at all plant materials and planting of trees, but not specifically revisiting our tree preservation framework. But in terms of things that we look at through our planning approvals, landscaping is something that we are recommending be part of the scope of work.
So I think that the issue here may be that the tree preservation bylaw simply doesn't apply on smaller lots. I can't remember what the cutoff is, but it's 1 acre or 1 hectare or something like that, 1 acre. So on a smaller lot, less than 1 acre with mature trees on it, right now the owner can cut those trees. I suspect what Councillor Fernandez is looking for is some way to protect those trees.
Okay. Councillor Fernandez, can you clarify?
And that's precisely what I'm concerned, especially around heritage districts. When you're looking at some of these big, huge, mature trees, you're making a significant change again on that property when you take out some of those really large, mature trees. So I'm trying to find a way to navigate and include that some way into this. Whether we have to add it into the fact that it could be a certain size, diameter tree, I don't know how we would do that, but it's a question I'm asking.
But would that not be looked at in the context of our existing tree preservation policy? And if the 1 acre size is incorrect, that's the place where we should be looking at it, not in the context of this?
I guess because they had landscaping on here, I wanted to ask the question.
Okay. No, that's fine. I'm trying to get some clarity from staff and understand where the appropriate place is to look at this, if there's a desire to do that.
So through you, Mayor Verbanovich, other than re-examining our tree cutting bylaw, I think that we can actually manage what is being asked for here with respect to tree cutting and preservation. I mean, one of our tools that's part of our current toolbox is tree saving plans that are required as part of site plan approval, which overlaps with the future landscaping. So we will definitely include that in our scope of review, and I'm hoping that addresses Councillor Fernandez's question and concerns.
Okay, and if it doesn't, then I guess it could be looked at in the context of that overall policy around tree preservation and what's the right size lot for that.
That is correct.
Does that address your concern?
That's fine.
Okay, great. There's nobody else, so it has been moved and seconded. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried unanimously. We'll now move on to item number 4. Natalie, and thank you, Dana, for the last section. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Through the chair, final question for you this evening is, how should community engagement occur in the preparation of the study itself? So as we outlined in our staff report, there are 3 options, and each of those options include a variety of tools. They all have a range of time frame, and together with them each have pros and cons. Our recommendation that's within the preceding paragraph to the table in the report is to have some form of consultation through each of the key stages of the project. And like has been mentioned previously, we haven't developed a work program yet, but generally when we do project planning, we do like to involve some sort of consultation, usually at an initial stage, partway through when we've developed scenarios or recommendations, and then towards the end. Depending on the nature of the engagement, the number of times that we engage, together with that impacts resourcing, budget, and then the length of time it will take to complete the project. So before you, we do have 3 options. One that we've titled traditional methods, and it includes things that we utilized through our official plan review, things that we're doing through Crosby as well, so drop-in sessions, full use of any social media tools that we have available today, project websites and such, things like that. Option 2 would include everything from option 1, plus a bit more, stakeholder interviews, a central hub that we can use for engagement. Option 3 is what we would term extensive consultation, and this is the one that would take the longest amount of time and the most significant amount of resources, because it would include things that are tools that we don't have readily available, and we would need to invest time and resources into setting up those tools as well as executing them. So I'll open the floor for discussion.
Okay. Certainly have some thoughts on this. I'll wait till others express theirs. Councillor Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think community engagement needs to be a crucial component of this. And that's what the whole intent of this the study is, to ensure that we have the right type of development, which speaks to the concerns we've heard from our residents. But in option 2, when it just says more costly than approach 1, what is that more costly? What's the fact, like, how much more costly? What is the cost for option 1 to begin with? Do we know that yet?
Through the chair, because we haven't done any work programming, we don't have an idea yet in terms of costs.
Oh, we did public consultation for our official plan, so we have an idea.
We did.
Yeah.
We also, through a report that we tabled last year on the PARTS program for communications, we had some costing in there.
Can you try to reference to those costs? So? No?
Not off the top of my head, but we can get back to you with some numbers.
Sure, I think it'd be helpful to know.
What we were trying to get out of today was an idea of the scope or magnitude of consultation, and then when we develop the terms of reference, we can come back with some costs associated with that and further dialogue about
greater
it.
tools engagement is always better, but again, we have to be cognizant of what the costs related to it as well. An aspect of time, where it says approximately 1 to 2 year, is that consistent to what staff are comfortable with, or that takes it too far out? I'm referring to option 2.
Through the chair, it's our understanding that we're trying to scope this so that we can complete this study within a 1-year time frame, which is why there's some options there for you. The number of times that we consult throughout the process, as well as the tools that we use, will indicate how long it is going to take.
Okay, all right. Thank you. That helps to answer some of my questions. I'll make comments after I hear other questions.
So, there's no motion here. So, just if you have some additional comments, if you want to make them. Yeah. No, we're giving general direction here.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I would like to have some of that information, but if the costs aren't too prohibitive for option 2, I think, as I said, we need to ensure that I can understand the speed with time that's required for this. But at the same time, we have to get this right. If we do it wrong, this will have long-term ramifications for our city, for our growth, as well as the character of the city. The thing is, at the end of the day, do we want greenfield development, loss of our prime agricultural land, or are we comfortable with understanding as our city evolves that there will be changes? But how are those changes? So that component needs to be gotten right. At the same time, my comments would be as well that outside of, inclusive of public consultation, we need to engage with our development community. They need to be inclusive of that conversation, knowing what their restrictions are, what could be stumbling blocks for them as well, and then try to balance both those perspectives from our residents and our community, as well as the development community as well, and try to approach accordingly. Thank you.
Councillor Fernandez.
Yes, I certainly agree that option 2 looks a lot more, I like it better, but how can council help? I mean, we're engaging in still a number of stakeholder meetings with regards to Crosby. There's plenty of opportunities, especially now that the weather is good for councillors who may be out at events. even a simple questionnaire that we could hand out, or you could post on our websites, on our Facebook. I mean, I think you really need to use the vehicle that you have right here in front of you to do a lot of easy, quick, dirty engagement with the public. Maybe it won't be as fine-tuned as maybe what you might be doing, but at least it opens the door for the conversations and gets the people who, especially the people who've been here, talking about intensification and infill, getting them to respond right off the bat. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to fill your inboxes with their thoughts. So I think you need to use us as your vehicle. I think we can be. I mean, I'm going to be meeting with user groups related to the Southwest Optimist Park. I know it's falling under a different name, but again, that for me is an opportunity to engage in the public and people who live within my community. So I would like to support option 2, but I would really think that you use us. We're out there. We're out in the community all the time, and if we have, a few quick notes that we can pass, or little cards or something, if you are concerned with infill, if you want to have comments, this is the person to send them. I think I'd be more than happy to do that and to be the legs around the community.
Councillor Etherington?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, I also prefer number 2, but could I ask a quick question? What is physical hub for engagement? What does that mean?
Through the chair, it can mean a variety of things. It's usually a centralized meeting place, and it could be online, it could be physical, it could be both at the same time. One example is something that the region did through their community building strategy, where they had the storefront. So that would be one example of a centralized physical hub where they had lots of engagement sessions there.
Okay, I asked the question because I've been at any number of public information sessions. I was at one last week on sidewalks, and I find that the type of meeting where you have boards and people wander aimlessly around are pretty useless. This one was a mix of the boards and addressing directly the audience and filling them in on whatever the subject is. And I much prefer that method. So when you get into those methods, that's my preference.
Okay, Councillor Marsh.
Thank you. So I'm just going to echo Councillor Singh's comments that absolutely we need to get this right. We need to have a strong level of engagement, not just the minimum level. However, I also agree that we need to get more creative. In terms of adding the level of engagement, we shouldn't just create a larger scope of work for the consultant and say, there you go, off you go. I think that we need to be able to dovetail a little bit more with the community engagement efforts that the city and other departments are already undertaking, for example, the neighborhood strategy. It is huge, and so why not utilize the existing resources that we are already engaging with and not have too much consultation of various levels to the same stakeholders. Also, I want to just add that in terms of the different phases of the study, I think clearly staff already and council, we already have a strong sense of what the issues are. So if the first phase of this phase 1 is issue identification, then I would suggest that we don't need to focus too much on consultation in the beginning, but that when we are reviewing alternatives before we're getting towards the end, I think that is the strongest level where we need to get the most engagement from all the stakeholders. And yeah, that's just my 2 cents worth, but you guys are the pros in terms of the planning. And I just want to add, we could also, I would offer myself as well, when I'm going out and talking with residents, if I have a link to give people, hey, give your feedback on this, because it affects the people in my ward quite substantially. I would be very interested to do that. And finally, just let's also consider using volunteers. We're ramping up our volunteer component in the city. We have added resources to that area a little bit, but anyway, I mean, perhaps that would be an area that volunteers would like to engage in. Thanks.
Councillor Netsky.
The key to this whole process is public engagement, specifically in the areas of concern. And since we adopted under question 2 the geographic area of the central neighborhood plus the Vanier area, that's the key area. And to really do the proper job, you really got to go through option 3. But however, you're only going to be dealing with a part of the city. You're not dealing with the whole city. So if you want to do proper engagement, you go this particular process of option 3, but you limit it to the area that basically has been adopted in that core area, basically, because that's where the issues are going to be, and that's where the concern is going to be. Is those people that have already been here? That's the area they're from, and you got to key into them. And the official plan process and zoning process that we've gone through in the past only catches maybe 1-2% of the entire public. But the tools that you have here, maybe it's a little stretching doing bus tours or bike tours or something of that nature. You may want to reconsider that, but I know it's an option that you're throwing out as a possibility. So I'm in favor of option 3.
Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah. As far as I'm concerned, when it comes to public engagement, we need to err on the side of, I don't think we can ever have too much public engagement. And I mean, if it's a matter of cost, then I think we have to reprioritize our costs. But and going along with that, if there are new ways of engaging the public, we need to be looking at them, because this doesn't just fit in with planning issues. It fits in with everything we do, and therefore I don't want to see. Unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, the option 3, which is the most extensive, is the most important. We don't really know what kind of time we're talking. We don't really know what kind of costs we're talking. But again, I emphasize that it is so important that if it is a costly thing, then we have, to me, it's a high priority, and we have to look at other areas to cut costs so we can do this.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
Yeah, I have just a couple of questions. First, I noticed that every option requires a consultant to facilitate. Is there anything that staff feel like they could do in-house, or is that completely off the table?
Through the chair, there are things that we can do in-house, and there are things that we will have to do in-house, and we can work with our communications staff on what we can achieve. It's just trying to find a balance between our existing resources on other projects as well as what communications staff is involved with. But things like setting up a website, using social media, that's stuff that we typically do in-house, and I think things that we have to retain in-house.
Okay, so for example, then in option 1, would we just be, because there's only the 3, there's the social media, the newsletter, and website, which you've kind of referenced, that we could do in-house. Would it just be the drop-in sessions that we would be requiring a consultant for?
Possibly. That was just one example of a tool, but things similar to that, we may need to retain outside consultant help to help facilitate those types of sessions or prepare materials for it. Again, it depended on the scope of work on the other previous questions that we already talked about this afternoon.
I'm finding this one a little bit difficult to give full feedback on, because I'm all for public engagement, but I feel like there's a lot that we could do in-house, and that may decrease the time and decrease the cost. But there's also new things that I'd like to try, because I think this would be a good one to work on. I am leaning towards number 2, and I can see some of that requiring some additional resources for, but not a whole lot, and that's where I guess I struggle with it a little bit. But one piece I wanted to ask is, between the three options, you have different time frames. There's obviously different costs associated with each one either. Also, but what if we were to cherry pick one or two out of option number 3 and put it into like an option number 2? I'm thinking in my mind the enhanced online engagement with videos might be something that could be really relevant for these topics, that people could go online and really provide their feedback, which in my opinion kind of ducktails on live streaming of any meetings or presentations that kind of happen. Is that something that we could provide feedback and look at?
Maybe I'll take an initial stab at this one. Definitely something we can look at, and once we program it, report back if we see some issues. What I'm kind of sensing is there seems to be quite a few people supporting an option 2+. What I can say, we, in order to do this, whether it's in 1 year or 3 years, we're going to have to outsource pieces of this work. The amount that we have to outsource will really depend on what we'd like to do our own work, and I think our council knows that, but we really are just, surtaxed with project-based work right now in planning. So once we go through all of the inputs that we receive today, we'll program it. If we think that we need to come back for clarification, or that we think there's either a major cost issue with regards to outsourcing, or that we're getting closer to the 3-year time frame and not the 1 year, we would also come back to council. I think it's fair to say on the 3 options that the likelihood of needing consultants increases as you go up in number. Developing a new electronic approach, that is probably the thing that would require us to go outside more so, because it's not something that we do presently, and it would actually have to be custom created for this. That and facilitation, because facilitation is extremely labor intensive, and also just to have someone actually sit through, and we also find we get better feedback from people when we're doing stakeholder interviews if it's not a city person, and they can actually just spill their guts out to someone who's that they're seeing as being objective, who's going to actually synthesize and package that for us. That would be like the other area of work that would actually we would be looking to outsourcing that. So I don't know if that actually helps at all, but that's sort of what I'm hearing is a 2. But if we can find a cheap way to do some of the coolest things in 3, let's do those.
Well, and it's not I'm not about throwing money at it, but it's not all about cheap. But I think we need to do it right, and I think this might be a piece where we can actually take something concrete and put it into videos and have it online. And so but having said that, I'd also like to see that the timeline stay as short as possible. I don't want those pieces to push it out into the 2.5, 3 year. I'd like to see all of it completed within that 1 to 2 year time frame, because it's an important document that we need to finish and we need to move forward on, but yet getting it right in the process. So I'd like to look at those 2, which I kind of see as one that I've outlined with regards to videos and live streaming of meetings if possible. I think it will provide a lot of context for people to provide feedback versus just reading something on their computer or via email. So that's what I would suggest, but within that 1 to 2 year time frame.
Okay, we've got another group of people. Sorry, Councillor Davey.
Thank you. So just some random thoughts as going through it. I look at the options. I'm not necessarily convinced that some of the options will result in better feedback, honestly. So I would echo, first I'd echo Councillor Arlington's comment initially. Now when I see drop-in sessions, I take that to be the sort of public information sessions that we've had, typically where there are boards up, but included in that would be some sort of presentation, a question and answer. Is that what drop-in session means? Okay. I've found those, in my experience, to be the most effective, and if we could just put in that stipulation that it is simply not boards being up, but there is a question and answer session, and that kind of takes into account stakeholder interviews, I think, somewhat in option number 2. And in terms of the physical hub, like it's, well, physical versus internet type hub is what I'm understanding. Again, I'm not really sure that. My concern is that I don't want to start throwing money at things that seem cool when the reality is, I think, looking back at the budget, we had a tax calculator, a cool little, I thought it was very innovative, where you can punch in your property taxes, pick and choose what the major issues are that council's dealing with, and I think we have like 10 people use it. So it's not a matter of being cheap, it's a matter of if staff genuinely thinks that we're going to get a better result from some of these options in 2 and 3, then I will defer to your expertise in that area. But what I don't want to see is us implement a very, like the tax tool type thing, something that's very innovative and works fantastic, but no one actually uses it. I'm not sure if that's really helpful feedback or not, but that's just my experience. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Schneider, you haven't spoken yet, have you? No? Okay, go ahead.
I think it's pretty evident around here that we all really appreciate and want the engagement of the citizens, as much information and input as possible in this. There's an education aspect to this, an informational aspect to it as well. I believe we will have e-engagement and tools here coming up this year that we voted in. So I think that might speed the process up, but I echo the comments of Councillor Singh and Councillor Galloway-Seelock about the need for it and the ability to maybe cherry pick and come up with a checklist from these 3 areas.
Councillor Marsh, you've already spoken once, right? Okay, so then Councillor Ioannidis.
Yes, through you, Mayor Verbanovich. I think, in essence, for this infill study, I think we're going to have to go look at option 1 because we want to coincide with this. But I think this is a broader discussion that we need to have, basically on community engagement when it comes to with our planning department in general. So I'm all in favor of option 3 and having all those looked at in a greater discussion at another point. I think that's something we should be looking at. But I think in essence for this study, I think we're looking at option 1 and somewhere and maybe some option 2 in there and to coincide, because if there's no point in going to option 2 and option 3 if it doesn't coincide with this study. It's just not going to make sense. So but I think a greater discussion is needed on this.
Councillor Marsh.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that staff, I have a question, just whether or not when you come back with your project plan for this, will we have an opportunity to then provide additional feedback before you launch into the 1 to 2 to 3 year project?
Okay, through you, Mr. Mayor, we weren't planning to come back with our terms of reference unless we encountered some issues with respect to achieving a reasonable time frame, having an affordability issue, or needing clarification. If that is something that council wants, we can do that, and we would. I can't commit at this point in time until we actually sift through all of the comments, commit to a specific date. But it also does mean, if we try and report before the summer break on this, it has the potential to actually delay the start of our project. But we can do that if that is council's preference. We were only going to come back if we actually thought that we had like a huge issue, that we weren't going to be delivering anything that we think is meeting the comments that we're hearing here today. Now, anything that is outsourced and does require an approval of council in terms of procurement, council would actually see that automatically, of course.
So just to ask then, how will you be communicating with council? How were you planning to communicate with council if council doesn't ask for a report coming back about just keeping us informed on the different stages of this project?
Yeah, so through you again, Mayor Verbanovich, it is, and we do a lot of project-based work, and it has not been our usual way to do business to actually get the terms of reference approved before we actually launch into it. So when we do update council, we update them through either an information report or sometimes communication directly to council. But we would have to come back to council if we think that, if we're struggling to actually put together a work program that we think meets council's expectations.
Okay, I just want to reiterate, I just want to emphasize that I agree with Councillor Galloway-Sealock that regardless of the work plan that comes forward, or that you end up pursuing, that we stick in an under 2-year time frame. I really think that that's key here.
Okay, I'll just make my comments. I tend to concur with the comments of those who have emphasized the importance of citizen engagement and extensive citizen engagement if we want this to work. Quite frankly, one of the biggest criticisms we get from people when we have these kinds of applications before us: didn't know about it, didn't hear about it, don't understand it, and if we don't really go above and beyond to try to engage the community and get meaningful input, then quite frankly, I think at the end of the day, the product we have is going to only marginally help us in terms of dealing with these issues going forward. All it'll simply do is we'll go through this process, and then we'll continue to have people coming back to us as part of any of those applications. And we'll hear we never have input, all the things that we often hear about. As I look at a number of the options, including some of the ones under option 3, there's not necessarily an extensive cost associated with them. Live streaming of meetings, there's a new app out called Periscope. It basically, quite frankly, one of the media outlets covered the State of the City speech with it, and all it took was a internet connection on an iPhone, covering and it was webcast. We can do many of these kinds of things without incurring extensive costs. Chalkboard videos, of 2 or 3 minutes a piece, typically cost, in the hundreds of dollars to create, as an example. Videos can be developed internally by us going out and quite frankly, getting our own video cam and developing them internally. And yes, there's some prep work required to do it in terms of the content, but it's not extensive cost. And I think all of these things are ways we can better engage people. I think not the least of which is we've also invested in new e-engagement tools and a new citizen engagement position in this year's budget. And so I can't think of a better way of engaging those tools and that new individual in something like this right from the beginning, and using that as a possible tool to assist us. So I would really encourage staff to take a closer look at that. I don't think it needs to add extensive amounts of additional time. I believe it can, in fact, that input can actually help staff, I think, do a better job and move the project along in a timely manner. So that 1 to 2 year time frame with parts of options 2 and 3, I think are certainly possible and can use some of the tools that we have within or are getting within the organization, along with some low cost additional stuff externally. I'm thinking like webinars. Those don't take a lot. Whether you look at I know we've done them before for the budget on Facebook and a Twitter town hall, Facebook town hall. Ask the expert. That's it. Thank you. So I think all of that is stuff that we can use, and it has little to no cost. It has some time cost, and I acknowledge that, and we would have to build that into it. So I'd encourage staff to take a closer look at that as they develop their work plan going forward. Councillor Fernandez.
I just had a quick question to ask staff. Yep. What is the, in consideration of my use the council as a vehicle, what kind of time frame are we anticipating? Because if if we want to take an opportunity to write something in our Kitchener Citizen columns, or if we do newsletters and updates to residents, this is the perfect opportunity for us to do that. So if you can give us a sense of when you'd be ready for us to do that, I think that would be a great way to start the public engagement and the discussion.
We can do that.
Great. So I think that covers everything off. Alain, is there anything else that you needed?
No, Mr. Mayor, we got some really good input, and we think we have a good sense of where council wants us to go on this. We will have to review all of the comments that we received here, weigh them, analyze them, try and develop a work program that we think comes the closest to achieving what this group here before us wants. And as I mentioned previously, if we encounter struggles because something is not clear, or if we think that the end product is something that is not a good match for what we've heard here today, we will come back to council. Otherwise, we will inform you of how we intend to proceed. So thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Alain, Janine, Tina, Dana, Natalie, and I'm sure there was some staff behind the scenes that also supported you with this. So want to thank you for all the work getting this thus far, and we look forward to getting additional reports on this in the future. Motion to adjourn, moved by Councillor Davies, seconded by Councillor Marsh. All those in favor, opposed, that's carried.